Hello and welcome and thanks for tuning in. You're watching Gravitas with me, Priyanka Sharma. Take a look at today's lineup. In the last few days, the LAC, the line of actual control, has been our top focus. We've told you about China's repeated unprovoked aggression. We've told you about Xi Jinping's tactics of distraction, his insecurity. Today we'll ask the all-important question, why does China repeatedly provoke India? We'll also tell you all about India's strategy to tackle China, peace with strength. But a new player may have thrown a spanner in the works. The United States has sent a stern message to China for its actions at the LAC and called India a partner. On Gravitas tonight, we'll expose America's vested interests. Why does Washington cozy up to any country that Beijing is bickering with? Also on the show, as the US president sits down with African leaders in Washington, he says he has a new strategy for the continent. On the show, we'll tell you why China will be an unspoken focus as Biden tries to woo African leaders. In Iran, a footballer faces the possibility of execution after campaigning for women's rights in the country. We'll tell you why he is now a symbol of resistance for Iran. How much time do you spend on your phone? How much time do you spend talking to your spouse? A new study finds that excessive smartphone use is hurting Indian marriages. Today, we'll tell you why it's high time you put that phone down. We begin tonight's show with a question. Why is it that China repeatedly tries to provoke a military confrontation with India? In 2017, China had a 2-month-long standoff with India at Doklam. China followed that up by building permanent military posts, helipads and trenches not too far from where the two armies faced off. Then in 2020 began the Ladakh standoff, which escalated into a conflict. When in Galwan, at least 300 PLA troops armed with clubs and heavy sticks attacked Indian soldiers. Guns were not used because both countries have given a commitment that they will not use bullets. China lost that battle. The PLA suffered more casualties. But that's beside the point here. My point is, why is it that 2 years since the standoff began, China has not completely pulled back? It's almost as if China wants to keep the issue alive by refusing to restore the status quo. Now China has shifted the arena to Tawang, but its tactics remain the same. So what gives? Is the People's Liberation Army provoking India under orders from the political leadership? Or are there rogue commanders? You may tell me, things cannot remain stable along such a long line of actual control that China shares with India. Not true. China shares land borders with 13 other countries. With Russia, it is a 4,300-kilometer long border, as opposed to 3,488 with India. But remember, there is no tension with Russia. In fact, Chinese President Xi Jinping calls the Russian President Vladimir Putin his best friend. But there is little peace and no stability on the LAC with India. Why is that? You may point at the fact that the LAC is undefined, sure, but it is clearly demarcated. So why does China try to create new facts on the ground by pushing into Indian space each time? The fact is, when China plays in a region with such high stakes, sticks and stones could easily become guns and bombs. And once that happens, it all really comes down to which side can militarily dominate the other. China has won a war with India, but that was 60 years ago. Since then, India has acquired more than parity. India has also blocked the Chinese near Doklam. As we speak, New Delhi is focused on border infrastructure, defense equipment. From the weapons in the hands of the Jawans guarding India to their hutments, things are looking up for India. But for the longest time, India's focus vis-a-vis China was bromance, not deterrence. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi changed the soft line. He has established a new approach: peace with strength. He gave peace a chance. He tried wooing the Chinese leader Xi Jinping with a personal outreach. There were numerous summits, photo ops in rather picturesque locations. At one point it was said that Prime Minister Modi had over-personalized India's diplomacy with China and was banking on his friendship with Xi Jinping to finally bring China to the table to work together in defining the LAC. Now that became a non-starter. Prime Minister Modi's personal outreach did not result in any diplomatic victory for India. The Ladakh standoff happened shortly after the Xi-Modi summit in Mamallapuram. That was back in October 2019. The standoff began in May 2020, and then came Galwan, and now Tawang. The hawks are flying again. It is a fact that Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping are both strong leaders. But the difference is that Xi prefers conflict over peace. He sees India as an ally of his great enemy. I'm talking about America. The Himalayas are now the zone of a new great game, and do not forget, aggression is integral to Beijing's foreign policy. New Delhi knows where the red line is. Communist China does not. And now America has added a fresh dimension to this clash. How so? By calling India an American ally. Let me read out a recent statement from the Pentagon in the context of Tawang. I quote, "We will continue to remain steadfast in our commitment to ensure the security of our partners. We fully support India's effort to de-escalate the situation." Notice the use of the word partner. It comes 2 months after the US called India an ally. But my question to all of you is India an American ally in the truest sense of the word? Not formally. The Pentagon statement can be read as an American outreach, and just that. You see, Washington has a track record of cozying up to any and every country that China is bickering with. And India is an Asian giant whom Washington wants to lean on to counter China, or for that matter, knit its Indo-Pacific policy around. Which also explains America's open support to India during Uri, the surgical strikes, Pulwama, Balakot, Ladakh, and the latest comment on Tawang. But notice one thing, India has steered clear of any such eyebrow-raising word as ally, and one does not wonder why. For starters, there is a big question mark on America's reliability as a partner. Its reputation outside the European confrontation with Russia is wobbly. It takes help more eagerly than it gives help. This is the same country that fled Afghanistan in the middle of the night. We can't forget that. So why should India trust America? Hence, New Delhi has chosen to be rather discreet about its strategy with America and chooses its words quite carefully. But questions will not go away. For example, what exactly is India's relationship with the United States? Are we an ally? Or is it simply a work in progress? Another important question, is the Quad grouping the signpost of the future? Only time will tell. In the meantime, it's evident the dragon will continue to breathe fire in the Himalayas. Staying with China. Last week, the Chinese president visited Saudi Arabia, a visit aimed at strengthening ties with the kingdom. Since then, we've been telling you the many outcomes of the visit, the many deals that Beijing and Riyadh have signed, the many projects that they've agreed to work upon. But the most fascinating yet controversial outcome of this visit is this. Look at this headline now. According to China Daily, Riyadh has okayed the use of Chinese textbooks. What does that mean? It has approved Mandarin language books for public consumption as well as educational purposes. These textbooks could, in essence, be meant for primary and high school students. They could be made a part of their curriculum. The Saudi Education Ministry has already certified them. Reports say that these books are especially designed for Arab students. They were created based on the experiences of Mandarin teachers who spent several years understanding Saudi Arabia's life and culture. Here's what the company behind the books has said in a statement. Allow me to quote. The books combine traditional Chinese and Arabic cultures and customs, creating an innovative style of expression and presentation adapted to the reading methods and habits of Arab people. The textbooks focus on practical usage and promote interaction between teachers and students with topics closely related to students' daily lives. That's not all. Reports further say that Saudi Arabia has also set up courses related to the Mandarin language in more than 9 universities in the country. It has also trained more than 300 local Chinese language teachers for the same. And besides this, the company behind the textbooks has also set up an HSK test center in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh. The HSK test center is primarily an institute which conducts these tests on proficiency in the Chinese language in particular. In October, more than 9 Saudi students took part in such a test. 60 more students are expected to take the test in the days ahead. So what exactly is the aim behind such a move? Well, on the face of it, the intention is to promote cultural and language exchange programs between the two sides. But that's just on the face of it. That's how Saudi Arabia perceives it. But it's hard to judge China's intentions behind all of this. I say this because Beijing has a track record of using Mandarin as a soft power tool. A tool to infiltrate campuses the world over and instill Chinese values and its own thought process. Allow me to digress a little. You might have heard of Confucius Institutes. We've carried several reports on them in the last 2 years. These institutes are named after the philosopher Confucius. He was a Chinese sage who lived 2,500 years ago. His principles of wisdom are used as China's handbook on governance. For centuries, Chinese civil servants had to pass exams based on these very texts, Confucian texts. In 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, he took special interest in Confucianism. At home, he started referring to it in his speeches, and abroad, he directed special funds to expand these institutes globally. The aim was to use them as a soft power tool to promote Chinese values, culture and language. As of today, there are more than 530 Confucius Institutes in dozens of countries across 6 continents, where 100 million students and counting. Beijing spends $10 billion a year on them. Imagine that. And what for? In the words of Xi Jinping, the aim is to tell Chinese stories well and spread Chinese voices well. But is that really what these institutes do? Not at all. In a 2017 report by the Wilson Center, Chinese students studying in the US claimed to be victims of monitoring. They accused faculty members at these Confucius Institutes of keeping an eye on their day-to-day activities. In December 2019, a university in Belgium shut down a Confucius Institute over allegations of spying. A professor at this institute was found conducting espionage for China. I could go on. In January 2020, the University of Maryland shut down a Confucius Institute. It found that Beijing was trying to politically influence academics. That's not all. On your screen now is a report from Human Rights Watch. It came out last year. The report calls Confucius Institutes extensions of the Chinese government. Censorship is rampant in such schools, and hiring of teachers is based on political loyalty to China, of course. China runs hundreds of such institutes the world over, and according to Human Rights Watch, many teachers feel uncomfortable with the presence of such schools on campuses. They feel their teaching could be compromised. This is how China infiltrates classrooms. It funds schools in the name of culture and people-to-people ties. And then it imposes censorship on campus. My point is simple. These schools serve only one purpose for China: push communist agenda, propaganda around the world, and ensure the party's influence spreads beyond China's borders. So what's all this got to do with Riyadh approving Chinese textbooks? Well, it may just be the first step in a series of planned moves by Beijing. Look at this headline now on your screens. Saudi Arabia too is about to get its first Confucius Institute. The University of Jeddah has apparently already given its approval. So my advice to Riyadh is this: when it opens the doors to Chinese universities, it must also watch out for Chinese incursions on its campuses. Right, and from West Asia, we turn our focus to Africa, another region which China is eyeing, in a bid to counter American interests. Much like West Asia, Beijing is selling its culture in Africa. It is building Confucius Institutes in African nations too, providing them with funds and infrastructure projects. Yet, it is America which remains Africa's biggest investor, and it seems to have woken up to the threat of Chinese overtures. Here's what America is doing to counter them. It is hosting African leaders for a summit, the first U.S. Africa summit since 2014. This three-day event kicked off on Tuesday with the aim of pulling Africa back into America's ambit. So who all are attending the summit? Leaders from more than 50 African nations, 50. 4 African nations haven't been invited, namely Mali, Sudan, Guinea and Burkina Faso. So why haven't they been invited? Because they've all witnessed coups recently. What is the aim of this summit? What will the talks be about? Well, a host of things like health, food, security, climate change, civil wars and outer space exploration. The first day of this summit was mostly about governance, the many political crises brewing in African countries, and what can be done together to end them. But instead of talking about solutions, American leaders indulge in a blame game, reminding African leaders about the risk that they're facing. All this due to the growing influence of China and Russia. Yes. Addressing the gathering, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin delivered an extended monologue on this alleged threat, a threat that he said can prove to be destabilizing for the entire African continent. Listen in.
We're witnessing the PRC expand its footprint on the continent on a daily basis, and as they do that, they're also expanding their economic influence. The troubling piece there is that they're not always transparent in terms of what they're doing, and that creates problems that will be eventually destabilizing if they're not already. We see Russia continuing to peddle cheap weapons. Some of that was mentioned before by one of our senior leaders here. And also, we see Russia employing mercenaries across the continent, and that is destabilizing as well. And so the combination of those activities by those two countries, I think that bears watching, and certainly I think their influence, again, can be destabilizing.
You heard that right. Their influence can be destabilizing. Is there merit in his argument? Well, both yes and no. You see, China and Russia are indeed making inroads into Africa. They're investing billions in the continent in the name of development. If we speak of China, it now operates more than 10,000 state-owned companies in Africa. They're spread across various sectors like energy, transportation, and infrastructure. In fact, since 2010, a third of Africa's power grid and infrastructure has been financed by Chinese state-owned companies. In 2020, China invested more than $2.96 billion in Africa. This was 9.5% more than China's investments in 2019. And it took the value of China's total investment in the continent to $735 billion. Just look at that figure. And it was the same story with Russia. Moscow is gradually increasing its influence in Africa too, through investments in the energy, trade, resources and infrastructure sectors. Reports say that Africa now depends on Russia for 40% of its overall grain supplies. This pretty much explains why African nations have refused to slam Russia for its actions in Ukraine. In March, during a UN General Assembly session, at least 25 of Africa's 54 states abstained or did not vote to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No prizes for guessing why. To put it simply, both China and Russia are on a charm offensive in Africa. But there's very little evidence to prove the same. Very little evidence to prove that their investments are aimed at destabilizing the continent. You see, the two countries are only filling the vacuum that America left behind in Africa, as it instead focused on its endless war on terror in West Asia. You see, African nations are of the opinion that America has ignored their concerns. It ignored their needs of investments and infrastructure. And now, when they're forming new ties, it is trying to hamper their freedom to do so. Plus, African leaders are upset with America for issuing sermons on human rights. They say when America reaches out to them, it preaches them on democracy and governance. But when China reaches out to them, it gives them hospitals and investment. What's more important? So what America is trying to do by this summit is only allay these existing fears of African nations. Fears that Washington will try to meddle in their internal affairs. Let me also say this. America is not holding the summit out of choice. It's conducting it out of compulsion, out of the need to counter China and Russia, the need to reclaim the influence it has lost in the last 10 years. Its argument of China and Russia trying to destabilize Africa is just an excuse to hide its own ulterior motives. Now that's something to think about. Let's move on now. China has made a sudden switch. It has gone from treating the virus as an enemy to abruptly being okay with it. The country has eased some of its COVID restrictions. Infections have skyrocketed as a result. Despite ramping up its health infrastructure, the hospitals are under strain. China is facing the threat of another massive outbreak. Take a look at this next report.
China could be on the verge of another COVID wave. Only days ago, the country was reporting close to 10,000 new infections daily. But as the cases hit a record high, China finally decided to ease its stringent COVID curbs. After 3 long years, mass testing has been largely ditched. PCR swab tests are voluntary now. And what's the outcome? We'll tell you. Today, China reported only 2,300 new confirmed cases. Doesn't it seem too sharp a decline? The actual number could be much higher. Who knows? How can infections be reported if there's no PCR testing to begin with? Another major reason for the plummeting figures is China's new decision. The communist regime has decided to leave asymptomatic cases out of its daily reports. Note that these asymptomatic cases accounted for the vast majority of new infections. China's excuse is it is impossible to accurately grasp the actual number of asymptomatic infections. While there might be some truth to that, it's worth asking, why the sudden change of heart? Hasn't that been the case since the pandemic began? Which brings us to another question. Is China trying to mask the fears of another COVID wave? There's a telling sign which points towards the real situation of the country. Chinese hospitals are under strain. They have been swarmed with COVID patients. Hospitals have not yet been stretched to breaking point, but staff shortages are becoming increasingly common. Reason? Frontline workers are themselves struck down by the virus. Some facilities have cancelled non-emergency surgery just to keep their services running. And this comes as China is actively setting up medical facilities across the country. ICU beds are being ramped up. New wings are being added to hospitals. What is China preparing for? Is there more to it than meets the eye? Another fatal COVID wave, perhaps? Which raises serious concerns for China, especially for its already fragile economy. Several industries have borne the brunt of zero-COVID policies. One major example is the aviation sector, which has suffered due to harsh travel restrictions. There are more than 50 airlines in China, but 3 of them, commonly regarded as the Big Three, collectively make up 71% of the overall market in China. We're talking about the state-owned China Southern Airlines, Air China and China Eastern Airlines. But the Big Three suffered huge losses due to the shrinking air traffic. Let's look at some figures now. Air China reported a net loss of $2.8 billion in the first half of 2022. China Eastern Airlines detailed a net loss of $2.7 billion. China Southern Airlines did slightly better, but it also reported a deficit of $1.7 billion. The Big Three have racked up losses of $21.8 billion since the start of 2020. Riddled with arbitrary lockdowns and rising fuel costs, the first half of this year was an extremely low point for China's civil aviation industry. However, now that zero COVID has gone down the drain, the travel sector is looking up again. Domestic flight activity has jumped to around 65% of pre-pandemic levels. This is a sharp increase from just 22% in late November. This means several thousand flights will be returning to the sky every day. But for how long will this wanderlust last with the rapid rise in infections? Long lines are forming outside Chinese hospitals. People are struggling to find medicines. A rush at pharmacies has led to a nationwide shortage of drugs that are used to treat a cold or the flu. Home testing kits for COVID-19 are also difficult to come by. Companies are telling employees they should return to the office. But many don't want to. Restaurants and streets are empty. Amid all this, will the people of China be willing to book flights and travel? The odds don't seem to be in China's favor. The fear of another COVID outbreak among the residents is too big to overcome. And who can blame them? Haven't they been conditioned like that for the last 3 years?
The protests in Iran recently reached India, and that too in the form of a lock of hair. This one. It was sent by an Iranian filmmaker to India's southern state of Kerala. The Indian state was hosting a film festival, during which the Iranian filmmaker Mehnaz Mohammadi was honoured an award. Mohammadi couldn't make it to Kerala because her passport could not be renewed, so the filmmaker decided to send a lock of her hair instead. She made a hard-hitting political statement without saying a single word. Women's hair has become a sign of resistance in Iran. This is ever since the women of the country decided to take on the Iranian regime following the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in the custody of the controversial morality police. And now, one young footballer has become the face of this resistance. His name is Amir Nasser Azadani. He's all of 26. And he has reportedly been sentenced to death. His fault? He stood up for women's rights and took part in nationwide campaigns. This footballer was part of Iran's national youth team. He has played Iran's Premier League. Azadani is a well-known name, and by hanging him, the Iranian regime is trying to send a message to all those who follow Nasser Azadani, especially the youth. It's clear it's a threatening message, a message to stay away from the streets or meet the same fate as Nasser Azadani. The footballer was arrested on the 16th of November. He was charged with accessory to Muharabe. Muharabe meaning waging a war against God. The regime says the footballer is a member of an armed group, one that intends to fight the very basis of the establishment of the Islamic regime. This is the story that the regime wants the world to believe, and it is a story the world knows that it must take with more than just a pinch of salt. As for the regime's legitimacy, that some people across Iran are questioning. Protesters want freedom, not just the freedom to wear what they like, but freedom in the more broader sense. The regime is clamping down hard as it can. It has already hung to death 2 protesters. Women are being shot in their genitals and face. At least 490 protesters have been killed, including 68 children. Reports say more than 18,000 people have been arrested. Many have been charged with acts of sabotage, assaulting security guards, setting fire to public property. Recently, Iran handed prison terms to some 400 protesters. Some of them are going to jail for 10 years. Like I was saying, this is the clerical regime's way of sending a clear message to anyone and everyone thinking of joining this revolution. Yes, I'm going to call it a revolution. This is repression, assault on free speech, assault on women. Reports say Iran could be ousted from the United Nations Women's Body. A draft resolution is in place, and there will be a vote tomorrow at the UN Economic and Social Council. Of its 54 members, many are expected to vote against Tehran. In all likelihood, the resolution will pass and Iran will be out of the Commission on the Status of Women. But will that make any difference? Not on ground. If anything, it will embolden Iran's claim of foreign interference. Iran has already written a letter. It says the vote will, quote-unquote, undoubtedly create an unwelcome precedent that will ultimately prevent other member states with different cultures, customs and traditions from contributing to the activities of such commissions. 18 countries signed on that letter. Only 5 will be able to cast their mandate come Wednesday. Either way, the result will be nothing more than symbolic. Will it create pressure on the Iranian regime? No. Last month, the UN Human Rights Council voted to appoint an independent investigation into Iran's repression. What happened? 2 people have been executed since. And the footballer Amir Nasser Azadani is now next in line. The global body representing professional footballers says it is shocked and sickened by reports that Nasser Azadani faces execution in Iran. You see, what the women and campaigners in Iran need is more than just words of condemnation. Think about that. Let's shift focus now and talk about a big breakthrough. Scientists in the United States have reached a major milestone. They have developed a method which is capable of delivering almost limitless supplies of energy. The process is called nuclear fusion, the same process which takes place on the sun. Picture this. Something that gives the sun its energy can be recreated on Earth. Fascinating, right? Our next report breaks it down for you. Take a look.
You might be aware of atoms, the particles which make up everything around us. These tiny atoms function in different ways. They bond together and break apart. They can absorb as well as release energy. The breakthrough in question features a process called nuclear fusion, a term you might have read in your textbooks or heard in documentaries. It is something which scientists from more than 50 countries have been trying to recreate since the 1960s.
It's the first time it has ever been done in a laboratory, anywhere in the world. Simply put, this is one of the most impressive scientific feats of the 21st century.
Let's understand what this process actually is. In nuclear fusion, 2 atoms are heated and forced together to make a heavier atom. It is the exact opposite of nuclear fission. the process that nuclear power stations currently use to generate electricity. Though the concept of nuclear fusion sounds simple enough, it is easier said than done. Getting two identical elements to combine is actually very hard. That's because they carry the same charge. And as you know, opposite charges attract while the same ones repel. A lot of energy is needed to overcome this resistance. But on the Sun, the process occurs naturally, all thanks to extremely high temperatures. And by high, we mean 10 million degrees Celsius high. The pressure on the Sun is 100 billion times that of the Earth. This makes the star of our solar system perfect for nuclear fusion. Scientists have tried to recreate these conditions on our planet several times. But to maintain such a high temperature and pressure is no easy feat. However, America's National Ignition Facility has achieved what others could not. The researchers successfully used a laser to turn a tiny amount of hydrogen into energy. The energy produced was enough to power about 15 to 20 kettles. But what is the fuss about? Why is this procedure so important? First of all, it is a clean form of energy. It has been described as the holy grail of energy production, as it doesn't need fossil fuels like oil or gas, so it doesn't generate greenhouse gases either. It could be the next big thing that helps us tackle climate change. In fact, its wide-scale use could help countries achieve their net zero targets by 2050. Second, it doesn't generate much waste. Its waste is less radioactive and much quicker to decay. Nuclear fission, on the other hand, produces a lot of radioactive debris, which is dangerous and must be stored safely for hundreds of years. Third, it is cost-effective. Most fusion experiments are carried out using hydrogen, an element which can be extracted cheaply from seawater and lithium. This means its fuel supplies could last for millions of years. Fourth, it is a safe form of energy production. Unlike nuclear fission, fusion cannot cause nuclear accidents. Fusion reactors are considered to be inherently safe. That's because the process automatically comes to a halt when the reactor is disturbed. On the other hand, the chain reaction involved in fission can cause lethal accidents if it goes out of control. The only setback is large-scale nuclear fusion is still several years away, despite a series of promising breakthroughs. So far, we don't have the technology to make this procedure efficient. The energy that goes into perfecting the conditions required for fusion is less than or equal to the energy produced by it. Even the successful U.S. experiment did not produce more energy than its input, and cost billions of dollars. Although researchers are celebrating the results and see them as a true breakthrough, they point out that much more work is needed.
Yes, there are very significant hurdles, not just in the science, but in technology. This is one igniting capsule, one time. And to realize commercial fusion energy, you have to do many things. You have to be able to produce many fusion ignition events per minute, and you have to have a robust system of drivers to enable that. So, probably decades.
The road ahead is long. The next big challenge for the scientists is to reproduce nuclear fusion more quickly and cheaply.
Right, moving on. Morocco's dream run at the 2022 World Cup is proof that fairy tales do exist. The Atlas Lions are just a win away from booking a place in the finals, and their journey so far at the showpiece event, dispatching the likes of Belgium, Spain and Portugal so far, is already being viewed as a triumph against colonialism. You see, Morocco and France share a rather complex relationship. The match is a direct contest between a former colony against its former colonizer. France ruled Morocco from 1912 to 1956, and even when the colonization formally ended, France's influence over the new sovereign North African nation did not stop. And this colonial past continues to shape the country's present to this day, including over its prize football team. Millions of Moroccans had migrated to France to fight in both the world wars, and the years after to find work and make a living. And now the two are integrated culturally, politically and economically. The first Arab and African nation to play the World Cup semi-final has already beaten two of its other former colonizers in Qatar, namely Spain and Portugal. Their match against Spain was layered with historical and political context, dating back to centuries of tensions and conflict from the Islamic conquest of the Al-Andalus, launched from the Moroccan shores, to the Spanish colonialism in North Africa. Even though both the countries have signed several bilateral commercial agreements, Spain being Morocco's second largest economic investor after France, they share a long and complex history. Morocco and Portugal also share a turbulent history, with the Portuguese occupying cities on the Moroccan coast from 1415 to 1769. No wonder, given its location at the crossroads between Europe and Africa. It is a melting pot of many cultures. The red-shirted Moroccan players have taken the World Cup by storm and have united many Arabs and North Africans in one region-wide cheer. Of the 26-member squad, only 14 were born in Morocco, while the others are of Moroccan heritage but were born in Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands and Canada. And one of them is defender Achraf Hakimi, the Spain-born defender who chose to play for the Atlas Lions. Hakimi shares a special bond with France's Kylian Mbappe, his Paris Saint-Germain clubmate. From playing video games and sharing meals to sitting next to each other on flights, they seem almost inseparable at the French Giants. They even share their goal celebrations. But their bonhomie will have to take a backseat, as their matchup will have a major impact on the outcome of this clash. We'll, of course, get you the latest. Let's move on now. If you're watching me right now from India, you must know someone who's getting married or perhaps planning a wedding. You could be the lucky groom or bride too. After all, it is the wedding season in India. Question: how many of you spend weeks and months planning a wedding? Another question: how many of you invest the same amount of time and energy in working towards a healthy marriage? So before I end the show tonight, I want to tell you about a new report. It talks about the impact of smartphones on your marriage. The study was conducted by a smartphone manufacturer along with cyber media research. It is an annual survey among Indians to assess the impact of smartphone usage on married couples. More than 1,000 smartphone users were studied across big cities in India like New Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, Pune and more. We often say smartphones have connected the world, but this study finds that excessive smartphone usage is forcing couples apart. I know that sounds rather excessive, exaggerated, but let me now share the findings with you. 67% respondents confessed to being on their phones while spending time with their spouses. 89% said they spend less time talking to their partners. 66% feel excessive smartphone use had weakened their bond with their spouse. There's more. 69% say they are not attentive enough when holding a conversation with their partner. 70% say they often get irritated if their partner interrupts them when they're busy scrolling through a stranger's newsfeed. Imagine that. We're not talking about working on a presentation, being on a Teams call or being engrossed in a conversation. But people just don't like it if they are distracted when they're on their phones, no matter how inconsequential the task. Forget about those Hallmark cards saying you couldn't bear the thought of being separated from your special one. In 2022, here's a more shocking statistic. More than 84% respondents in the study said they just couldn't bear the thought of being separated from their phones. Almost as if it's a crucial organ. Smartphone addiction is not new. Its impact on relationships has been studied before. A 2016 study found that those who were more dependent on their phones were less certain about their relationships, even less satisfied in their relationships. I'll leave it to you to put two and two together. Now that I've told you what the study found, I want to ask you, are you surprised? Look at how smartphones have taken over our lives. In 2021, India had 750 million smartphone users. It is poised to be the second largest smartphone maker in the next 5 years. What's more? Some more figures. India will have 1 billion smartphone users by 2026. We are hooked to our phones when we're eating, when we're unwinding, when we're commuting, even when we're crossing the road. Even at family dinners, we're busy scrolling through social media instead of engaging in meaningful conversation. Forget about saying goodnight to our partners or tucking in the kids. Most of us would admit that our phones are the last thing we look at before calling it a night. So I ask you tonight, are you married to your smartphone? Are you hooked to technology? Are you giving more time to a gadget instead of your partner? Look, there's no denying it. Technology has made our lives easier. Smartphones have opened up the world, connected all of us. Everything is available at a click. Information is more accessible. Meeting people is easier thanks to dating apps. Social media has connected people across the world. But at what cost? We've seen those memes of what couples do to unwind, and no, it's not a romantic date or a candlelit dinner. They're hooked to their phones. So tonight I suggest you put down that phone and focus on your partner, or else your relationship with your smartphone could cost you a far more important relationship. Time now to take a look at what else is happening across the world in Gravitas Global Headlines.
Ukraine says it has shot down multiple Iranian-made drones launched at the capital by Russian troops in their latest attack on Kyiv. A Reuters report suggests that Russia's flagship Urals crude has been sold at deeper discounts this month following a European ban on Russian oil imports, and India has bought barrels at well below a $60 price cap agreed by the West. Iran says that officials from the UN nuclear watchdog would visit the country in the coming days with the aim of resolving ambiguities over claims of secret activities. UK Prime Minister Sunak expresses sorrow over migrant deaths in the Channel after a small boat carrying migrants sinks off the southeastern coast of England in freezing temperatures, killing 4. Love is love, says U.S. President Joe Biden as he signs the same-sex marriage protection bill into law. Large crowds at the White House celebrate the legislative milestone. Republican Senator Marco Rubio announces bipartisan legislation to ban Chinese app TikTok amid concerns that the app could be used to spy on Americans. In a move towards gender inclusivity, the Cambridge Dictionary updates the definition of man and woman to include those who identify themselves as a gender other than their biological sex. At least 120 people are dead as the worst floods in years battered the Democratic Republic of Congo's capital, Kinshasa. The president blames climate change for the devastating floods. Argentina stormed into their 6th World Cup final after beating 2018 runners-up Croatia. Lionel Messi scored from the penalty spot and Julian Alvarez scored twice for the two-time champions at the Lusail Stadium. Messi now holds the record for most goals scored by an Argentine at the World Cup. India post 278 for 6 on day 1 of the first test. Cheteshwar Pujara and Shreyas Iyer stitched together a 149-run partnership to rescue India on their opening day. Pujara scored 90 while Iyer was unbeaten on 82 as the visitors recovered from 48 for 3 to post 278 for 6.
We end tonight's show with one of the greatest mysteries in the history of aviation. I'm talking about the ill-fated Malaysian Airlines flight MH370. It disappeared 8 years ago. The plane took off from Kuala Lumpur. On 8th of March in 2014, it was headed to Beijing, but it never landed there. It disappeared from the radar midway. No one knew what happened to the flight, where it landed or crashed. Search operations went on for months, years. They found nothing. In 2015, Malaysian authorities declared all 239 people on board dead. 7 years later, a part of the plane's body has been found. It is a landing gear door. The debris was originally found by a fisherman 5 years ago when it washed up on the Madagascar shore. Unaware of its significance, the fisherman used the debris as a washing board all this time, until someone spotted it about a month ago. The piece of landing gear from the flight suggests that the wheels were down when the plane hit the ocean. Now that has raised some serious concern. Experts suggest whatever happened with the flight was not an accident. The flight was deliberately crashed. But who could do that? Experts say either of the pilots intended to destroy the plane. Why do they say that? Because the discovered debris has fractures on all the sides. There are signs of extreme force of penetration right through the debris. And that seems to indicate something. What's that? That the flight was in a high-speed dive to ensure that it broke up into as many pieces as possible. According to engineers, the flight did not land softly on the ocean. It crashed and hit the ocean with full force. Experts also say the remains suggest that whosoever crashed the plane tried to sink the aircraft as fast as possible. Also intended to hide the evidence of the crash. You see, pilots do not usually lower the landing gear during an emergency landing on water. If anything, it increases the chances of the aircraft breaking into several pieces. It can also increase the chances of the plane sinking quickly, giving survivors very less time to get out. So why did the pilots of the aircraft lower the landing gear? Was it some miscalculation? Incompetency perhaps? Or a clear will to crash the plane? The mystery remains. And we leave you with the images of the debris that has brought back to life the haunting story of MH370. Thanks for watching Gravitas tonight.